I mean, it's been an incredibly long 2 months, especially with internet time. Usually things flare up on the internet and vanish and are forgotten as quickly as they sprung up in the first place. But it's I'm still here.
Hello and welcome to MSNBC.com live stream. I'm Nellie Bowles. It's certainly been a trying 2 months for anyone involved in the Gamergate controversy, from the proponents to the targets to everyone in between. To talk about the social, cultural, and even economic implications of what Gamergate is, and also to define what Gamergate is, I'm joined today by Recode Associate Editor and my colleague, Eric Johnson, and Gamasutra Editor-at-Large, Leigh Alexander. Thanks for coming. Eric, I'd like to start with you. You've been writing about the video game industry for years now. Have you seen anything like Gamergate before?
Not really. Even though Gamergate, we're talking about people who have thought this way for a while and people who have behaved in individual ways like this before. This organized action is something that's very new from a consumer's perspective. Gamergate is tracing back. Maybe we should explain a bit about sort of what it is here.
Yeah, that'd be great.
On the surface, Gamergate supporters claim that they're interested in journalistic ethics and in corruption. But if you look closer, that's not really the full story. What they're really interested in is sort of it's a reaction to the growing voices of women in game development and in the gaming media. And so what we're seeing here is consumers who are unhappy with that growing voice, who are reacting to it, who are lashing back at it. And the win condition, if you will, is really taking those voices out, is to basically bringing games back down to a place where they are more homogeneous, where that influence, which it defines as corruption, is not really allowed. And that sort of organized consumer, reaction that's totally new here. Yeah,
Leigh, do you agree with that definition of Gamergate that Eric just gave? Is that sort of how you view it also? I know it's a term that's used in a lot of different ways.
I'm going to do my best to answer your questions. I'm coming to you guys from London, and the quality of my audio is not very good. I think you asked me if I agreed with Eric's categorization of Gamergate. And if I heard him correctly, he said that he believes that it is an anti-progressive movement masquerading as an anti-corruption movement. And if that's in fact what he said, I absolutely agree with that. I think the corruption thing can pretty easily be debunked if we look at the targets that they're going after and the method in which they're going after those targets. I think this is a group of core consumers accustomed to being primarily catered to by the video game industry who are unable to deal with the fact that it is now diversifying, moving on, welcoming in new audiences, new creators, and new opinions. I think that's troubling them.
And Leigh, you've made waves in the industry through your criticisms, and you've even been called a threat to creative freedom by some of these Gamergaters. How do you respond to that?
I think that when we talk about creative freedom, they've clearly basically miscategorized what creative freedom is. Creative freedom is developers and writers being able to make and discuss whatever they want. And when they say, well, that is what we want, we're not seeing them act on that when they want to squash discussions about politics, they want to squash discussions about feminism. There is no media cabal that has a stranglehold on the game development industry. We want to have developers actually have more creative freedom to create outside of the traditional... Hello?
Oh yeah, could you tell me a little bit also about how this escalated?
I'm sorry, are you asking me how it escalated?
Yes, sorry.
How the Gamergate incident itself escalated, or how this sort of tension between creatives and progressives and conservatives escalated?
How the Gamergate itself escalated and your role in it. Because I know I read the story that you wrote that sort of said the end of gamers. And I know that was a big part of what galvanized a lot of this anger. And it's cited by a lot of people as sort of one of the core moments in the history of Gamergate. So maybe talk about that and the experience of writing that and how it felt afterwards and how it went from there.
Yeah, if I can say so myself, I think the editorial I wrote did catalyze it. It was like throwing a match onto a pile of kindling and lighter fluid. Again, this tension has been going on in the video games community for some time, where game developers have been sort of risk-averse and constricted to making and marketing to the same people. Now we have a confluence of industry factors where they no longer have to do that, and there's a broadening bench of representation of criticism and more creative freedom for developers to work in different fields and to express, different qualities through their work, and I've been writing about that. So when I observed the harassment of Zoe Quinn, a game developer who her game was controversial even before her ex published a salacious blog post about her because she dared to do a game with no graphics that was about depression. When I observed the harassment of her, I became frustrated at what I perceived to be the terroristic dominance of traditional appetites in what should be a diverse and creative field. And the thing that I wanted to say was to tell game developers, I didn't write that article for gamers. I wanted to tell game developers that they had that freedom to address whomever they wanted, and if they didn't want to address this audience of screaming harassers any longer, there were other consumers that appreciated what they were doing. So that was my main intention. I know that my tone was, Deadspin described it as prosecutorial. I'll accept that. But a lot of us have been angry for a long time about feeling underrepresented or feeling like our voices are less safe or less valued in games. So I really wanted to come out swinging at this fear.
So I want to ask you, another female target has been Anita Sarkeesian. Is this part of a broader, is Gamergate part of a broader anti-feminist movement in the gaming world that goes beyond the gaming world, or is it just part of the gaming world?
I think, in fact, Anita's work has probably attracted sexists who have no interest in video games because they can't even stand to hear conversations about feminism. It's interesting that Gamergaters purport to be pro-ethics in criticism because Anita does, very accessible, relatively informed criticism about specific issues of video games, even though she likes them, even though she advocates wanting to play games that are sometimes problematic. And what is more ethical than critiquing something that you love? So for me, when I see the harassment that she receives, it's some of the strongest evidence in my climate for a fear of progressivism in video games.
Eric, do you agree? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sort of just this idea that there's a conversation in games and that the press should be able to write about more than just what are the new games, what's being shown at E3, what's the latest game trailer. There's definitely value to that, what's called the enthusiast press. And there's definitely, for certain people, there's games that I'm a big fan of and that I benefit from following, all the fun, buzz and hype about, oh, here's what's coming up. But that's not the end-all, be-all of games discussion. And the unfortunate reality is that Gamergate has viewed people trying to break from the mold, people like Leigh, people like Anita. Basically, it's viewed people trying to talk about other things and to question whether or not everything's, hunky-dory, in saying that, well, no, if they're criticizing that, I think it's tied to the fear of censorship. It's the idea is that, oh, these people are coming in and they're criticizing, next thing they're going to do is they're going to take away our games, which of course is nonsense. But that's what they're afraid of, I think.
Leigh, what advice would you give to young women, especially young female coders and developers, sort of in light of all of these threats and in light of this culture?
Well, obviously we have to take threats and abuse very seriously, and I call upon people both in and out of the games industry to passionately get behind refusing to allow our culture to tolerate the harassment of women in games or in any other discipline. But for young women who are watching this go on, I want to tell them that's only a small part of the game industry. Yes, it's a visible and noisy and scary part, and again, take your safety seriously and take care of yourself. But there are the next generation of game developers is even more diverse than this one. I go to schools and I see all women independent teams of students. I want them to know that the game industry that's showing up in the news right now is not the real game industry, and they we're doing this so that they can have a future to participate. We're fighting against this type of thing so that they can have a future to participate. And I hope they don't get discouraged. I hope that they know that there's alternatives and independent culture and new scenes for them to forge forward into and participate in and love.
Yeah. Eric, is this movement at all rooted in a fear of losing ground to women in a largely male-dominated sort of gaming culture?
Well, I think that's something that's, there's definitely a fear of change. I'm not sure if losing ground is the right way of thinking about it. You look at the people who are being targeted by this movement, who are being critical of games and of games culture, and I don't think they're really advocating for an end to any game that has sexist tropes or an end to any discussion that might be happening about these topics. I think what they're really saying is it's more about gaining ground. It's about expanding the amount of ground that people can stand on. I don't really, just from having researched this, I don't really see people saying that these problems in games mean that it's about a zero-sum game. It's not about taking away from people. It's sort of adding to a bigger discussion.
Well, what do you think are the long-term effects of this?
So long-term, I think it's going to be really interesting to see. I mean, let's hope that we won't see any more threats like the ones that have been issued against Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, Anita Sarkeesian. I'm fingers crossed that we won't have anything more like that. But if we do, I think it's really going to be imperative for the mainstream of the gaming industry to take a stronger voice on this. So far, apart from sort of a few very bland and non-committal statements from the ESA and the IGDA, which are industry groups, there hasn't really been a lot of discussion of this. There haven't really been any companies taking a firm stand on this, and I think long term, if Gamergate does continue, if we do continue to have this debate, it'll really be time to really have the industry think about sort of how are we creating this culture, how is the low representation of women among game designers, game creators, what effect does that have on the quote unquote default gamer, the male gamer that's really at the center of all this.
Yeah. Leigh, what do you think? Do you agree that these are the long-term effects?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. I think a lot of these protesters are simply misinformed, and rather than fearing losing ground, they take any criticism of gaming culture as a personal attack. They see any desire to change the status quo as something that's going to cause them to lose. And, what I hope will happen as a result of all this is that we interrogate the avenues that led us, to this environment. We interrogate the ways that we do content creation that have sort of furthered these values, and we simply have alternatives. We simply look for ways to do better at welcoming in new creators, new appetites, new kinds of games, and new players. And, I personally don't believe that it's possible for criticism or anything to change what is, but we can create alternatives, we can create choices, we can broaden, grow, and nourish the gaming medium, which is what criticism does. I think it's a huge misconception when they think that women or feminist critics or anyone are trying to go around and put X's on all the games and censor them. That's not what anybody wants. We just want alternatives. We just want options.
Great. Thank you so much. Leah and Eric, thank you so much for being here. Leah, editor-at-large of Gamasutra, and Eric Johnson, associate editor of Recode. Thank you guys for coming in.